It is time for our 3 next vocabulary words of this unit. We're going to take a look today at pollution, conservation, and something called activism. So I'm going to go ahead here and cover up. So what is pollution? Pollution is the introduction. Pollution is the introduction of, and this is a big word here, it's the introduction of contaminants. Contaminants, that means things that are dirty, that don't belong. So pollution is the introduction of contaminants into the biosphere. So pollution is the introduction of contaminants into the biosphere. And again, contaminants are things that don't belong somewhere, right? They could be microscopic or they could be incredibly large, like a refrigerator being dumped on the side of the road. That would definitely be a contaminant. So what we're going to write here in the details for pollution is when we are thinking about pollution, this is something that is caused by human actions, right? So when we are talking about pollution in the context that we are for this unit, these are things caused by human actions, right? Humans putting something that doesn't belong in the biosphere. So there are several different types of pollution which we're going to learn about. So I'm just going to do kind of 2 different examples over here. So one of the types of pollution we have is air pollution. And we are probably most familiar with air pollution in the context of cars and different vehicles letting out their exhaust. But there's also air pollution that comes from factories and industry, even air pollution we can think in the form of smoking tobacco or vaping. That's definitely also a form of air pollution. Another type of pollution we have is water pollution. And water pollution could be like an oil spill, or it could be somebody dumping chemicals into a body of water. And then another one that you might not have considered as pollution, but we'll be talking more about, is noise. The fact that humans have lots of things that make incredibly loud noises, like airplanes taking off or ships that are cruising through the ocean and crossing from one side of the ocean to another. They're going to put noise, which is a contaminant, into the biosphere, and that's going to end up impacting lots of living things. So again, air pollution, water pollution, those are ones you're probably familiar with, and you may not have considered that noise is also a type of pollution too. So again, the pollution is the introduction of contaminants into the biosphere. Our next 2 words are slightly more positive words, and they are words about how we can stop and reduce some of the human actions and the impacts we're making on our planet. So our second word today is the word conservation. I know my writing got a little bit squished there. It's C-O-N-S-E-R-V-A-T-I-O-N, conservation. So what is conservation? Conservation is the careful management. Conservation is the careful management of Earth's living. Conservation is the careful management of Earth's living and non-living resources. So management means, taking control of what you're doing, taking responsibility. So conservation is the careful management of Earth's living and non-living resources. And remember, resources are things like water or air or sunlight or food sources and animals. So the key about conservation is if you do conservation, it prevents resources So conservation prevents resources from running out. So conservation prevents resources from running out, right? Because if somebody's managing them, if they're being responsible, then they're watching what happens, right? And they're making sure people are only using as much as they absolutely need, and we're not using like crazy, ridiculous amounts. I'm gonna do two different examples here. So one of them would be like turning off the sink, right? Turning off the sink, that saves H2O, right? That prevents us from, using up too much of our nice clean water. So turning off the sink, that's a very simple thing everybody can do to do conservation at home. An example of a conservation that happens at a much bigger level is, some of you may know that if you want to go fishing, right? If you want to go to like Calero County Reservoir and you want to do some fishing, or you want to go to the ocean and do fishing, there are laws that limit how many fish you can catch. So another example of conservation is laws limiting how many fish are caught. So that's why if you go fishing, you have to have a fishing license, because there are rules that go along with fishing. If you're a commercial fisherman and you're going out for lobsters or crabs or clams, there are limits on how much you can bring back to shore. So that would be an example of conservation, right, where we're managing a living resource, and that's happening at like a government level. Turning off the sink, that's something you do at home at a very local level, but that also plays a role in what we call conservation. So we're going to be looking at a lot of examples of conservation, and oh my goodness, this is what your end of the year project is going to be about. It's going to be about conservation. And then very kind of closely related to conservation, I want to bring up this word because it is a big part of conservation, and you can't have lived through this past year that we have experienced without knowing what activism is and how important activism is to make change. So activism is the action. Activism is the action of using, it's the action of using campaigning, and we'll talk about that, what that is in a moment. Activism is the action of using campaigning to bring about, the action of using campaigning to bring about political or social change. So the action of using campaigning to bring about political or social change. So in the details I'm going to write is part of successful. And remember, if we want success, we have to double the C and double the S. So activism is part of successful conservation. So if we want people to be careful about living and non-living resources, we often have to do activism. We have to do campaigning in order to get people and governments to change, right? Political, that means change happening at a government level with laws and policies. Social change is changing the way people behave when they're at home, right? When they're out shopping, and how they behave in society. So here's where we're going to put some examples of what this campaigning is, right? So activism is using TV or print ads, right? Or commercials where you encourage people to change their behavior, like to turn off the water in the sink. Another form of activism is calls or letters. Calls or letters to elected officials. So doing calls and letters to elected officials. And as many of you have seen over the past year with Black Lives Matter, doing protests and different kinds of marches. So protests or marches, those are also an important way to raise people's awareness and advocate that we want to see things change. And again, this is being used right in the context of conservation, taking care of our earth and our resources, and by doing things like TV and print ads, calling and sending letters to elected officials, doing things like protests, marches, and demonstrations, that's a way that we can encourage political change, right? Getting laws to be passed or changed, and social change, which is changing the way people think and they act and they behave. So again, our 3 vocabulary words were pollution, conservation, and activism. And conservation and activism are ways that we can reduce pollution. There are ways we can reduce our other word we had last week, climate change. They're a way that we can make sure that biodiversity stays nice and high, and that our planet's resources are going to be available not just for you, but for your kids and your grandkids, and that we are taking care of the planet we've been given. So that is it for today. I'll leave this up a couple more seconds. And remember, if you missed something, go back and rewatch the video, which is linked on our Canvas page for today.